Picture a single company so vast, so unimaginably wealthy, that it didn't just trade in goods, it traded in human destiny. It could declare war, crown kings, and erase entire nations from the map, all in pursuit of profit. At the height of its power, this corporation was worth an estimated $8 trillion in today's money. To put that in perspective, you could take Apple, Microsoft, and Saudi Aramco, combine them all, and they would still look small. But here is the strange part. This was no modern tech empire, no Silicon Valley giant born in an age of computers. This monster of commerce existed more than 400 years ago, in a world lit only by candles and sailing ships. Its name was the Dutch East India Company, and in its time, it became the richest, most powerful corporation that humanity has ever seen, or perhaps ever will see again. A business that behaved like an empire. Think about that for a moment. A company that could raise its own armies, a company that minted its own coins, signed its own treaties, and ruled over millions of people across distant continents. Not a country, a business. How was this even possible? How could a group of merchants from a small, rain-soaked country in Northern Europe rise to command more power than the mightiest kings and emperors of their age? To understand it, you have to imagine the spice trade as the oil of its time. A single ship returning home filled with pepper, nutmeg, and cloves could make ordinary men richer than they had ever dared to dream. Yet wealth like this never comes without blood. Behind the gold and glory lay shattered kingdoms, broken promises, and entire islands soaked in violence, secrets the company would rather you never knew. But every empire, no matter how invincible it seems, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And the greatest corporation in history would one day crumble into debt, scandal, and total collapse. How did it climb so impossibly high? And what force finally brought this titan to its knees? Stay with me, because this is the astonishing story of the company that changed the world, and the mystery of how it all fell apart. To understand the rise of this monster, we must travel back to the late 1500s to a small, waterlogged corner of Europe. The Netherlands was not yet a great power. It was a collection of provinces fighting a desperate war for survival against the mighty Spanish Empire. But the Dutch had one extraordinary weapon: the sea. These were a people born to water, masters of shipbuilding, navigation, and trade. Where others saw a hostile ocean, the Dutch saw highways stretching to the very ends of the earth, paved with profit. And there was one thing that drove every European nation mad with desire: spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. Today, they sit forgotten in our kitchen cabinets, but 4 centuries ago, these tiny seeds were worth more than gold, more precious than diamonds. Why such madness over spices? In an age before refrigeration, they preserved meat through brutal winters. They masked the stench of rotting food. They were medicine, status, and luxury all at once. To control the spice trade was to control the wealth of the world. But these spices grew thousands of miles away, in a mysterious archipelago known as the Spice Islands. To reach them, ships had to survive a voyage so terrifying that most men who set sail never returned home. The ocean swallowed them whole. For decades, the Portuguese and Spanish guarded these sea routes like jealous gods, keeping their maps secret and their rivals out. The Dutch were locked out of the greatest fortune on earth. But that was about to change in the most unexpected of ways. In 1592, a Dutchman named Jan Huygen van Linschoten did the unthinkable. After years working secretly inside Portuguese trade, he stole their guarded navigation secrets and published them for all the Netherlands to see. the locked door was suddenly thrown wide open. In 1595, the first reckless Dutch expedition set sail for the East. 4 ships, hundreds of men, and a fortune in hope. What happened on that journey would be a brutal lesson written in disease, mutiny, and death. Yet it would light a fire that nothing could extinguish. After 2.5 agonizing years, only 3 battered ships limped home. More than half the crew had perished, but in their holds lay something miraculous: spices. And the profit was so staggering that it erased every memory of the men who died to bring it. Suddenly, greed gripped the entire nation. Dozens of rival companies sprang up overnight, each racing to the east, each undercutting the others. The chaos was about to destroy them all. And from that desperate chaos, a revolutionary idea would soon be born. For decades, the Dutch East India Company seemed untouchable. Its ships filled the horizon, its warehouses overflowed with spice, and its shareholders grew fat on dividends. But beneath this glittering surface, something quietly dangerous was beginning to take root. A secret the directors would do anything to hide. Here lies the great illusion. The company paid out enormous dividends year after year, sometimes reaching 40%. Investors celebrated, believing they were partners in an empire of endless profit. But where exactly was all this money truly coming from? The answer would shock them. The truth was buried in the company's own accounting books. To keep shareholders happy and confidence high, the directors paid dividends not always from actual profits, but increasingly from borrowed money. It was a financial sleight of hand that few outside the boardroom could see. Think about what this means. The richest company in human history was slowly borrowing to maintain the very illusion of its wealth. Every grand celebration, every promise of riches was being financed by an ever-growing mountain of debt. And mountains, no matter how vast, can collapse. But why would such brilliant, calculating men take such a reckless risk? The answer reveals something deeply human about power itself. The directors feared that any sign of weakness, any cut in dividends, would spark panic and shatter the trust that held the entire empire together. And so the machine kept turning. More voyages were launched, more soldiers hired, more forts built across distant shores. The costs grew staggering. Every expansion that looked like strength was, in reality, adding another crack to the foundation no one dared to examine too closely. Far from Amsterdam, in the spice islands and trading posts of Asia, another problem was festering. Corruption. Company officials, thousands of miles from any oversight, began enriching themselves, smuggling goods and falsifying records. The empire was bleeding from wounds it couldn't even see. Imagine being a shareholder back in Holland, blissfully counting your profits, completely unaware that across the oceans your fortune was being quietly stolen, mismanaged, and gambled away. The distance that once made the company powerful had now become its greatest vulnerability. Yet here is the most chilling part of the story. The signs were there. The warnings existed. A few clear-eyed men inside the company saw the danger approaching and tried to raise the alarm. But powerful voices silenced them, terrified of what the truth might unleash upon them all. And so the stage was set for disaster. An empire built on spice and ambition, now secretly resting on debt, deception, and decay. The question was no longer whether the illusion would shatter, but when. And what would happen to the world when the greatest company in history finally fell? By the dawn of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company stood like an unshakable colossus straddling the oceans. But beneath that gilded surface, something invisible had begun to rot. The empire was still expanding, still glittering, Yet the very foundations that had made it immortal were quietly beginning to tremble. The first crack was greed itself. The very hunger that had built the company now turned inward like a slow poison. Local officials, governors, and clerks scattered across distant ports began lining their own pockets, smuggling spices, falsifying ledgers, and quietly betraying the empire that had made them rich. Thousands of miles from Amsterdam, the company's vast distance became its curse. Orders took years to cross the seas, and by the time decisions reached the colonies, the world had already changed. Corruption festered in that silence, unseen and unstoppable, eating away at profits no one in Europe could even measure. Then came the wars. The company had always fought, but now its enemies multiplied. The English, once mere rivals, grew bolder, faster, and hungrier. Across the trading lanes of Asia, cannon fire echoed more often, and every battle drained the company's treasury of fortunes it could no longer easily replace. Maintaining an empire was staggeringly expensive. Forts had to be garrisoned, fleets repaired, soldiers paid, and entire colonies defended against ever-growing threats. The company was bleeding money in 100 places at once, and the spice profits that once seemed endless were no longer enough to stop the wounds. And then the spices themselves began to lose their magic. For a century, pepper, nutmeg, and cloves had been worth more than gold. But as competitors flooded the markets and tastes shifted, prices began to fall. The treasure that had built an empire was slowly becoming just another ordinary commodity. To survive, the company shifted its gaze toward new treasures, textiles, coffee, and tea. But this new trade demanded even larger investments, deeper risks, and more ships than ever before. The empire was forced to borrow, to gamble, and to stretch itself thinner across a world that was rapidly transforming. In Amsterdam, the directors clung to their old glory, refusing to see the danger. They paid lavish dividends to shareholders, even as debts piled higher, draining the company's reserves to keep up appearances. It was a dangerous illusion, a beautiful mask hiding a body that was slowly starving from within. Meanwhile, the ships kept sinking. Storms, disease, and battle claimed vessels, and men by the thousands. Each lost ship carried away not only sailors, but fortunes in cargo that could never be recovered. The ocean, once the company's pathway to riches, was now quietly swallowing its empire piece by piece. By now, the cracks were no longer hidden. They were spreading through every layer of the empire, from the distant colonies to the heart of Amsterdam itself. The greatest company in history was wounded, yet it still stood. But a question now hung in the air like smoke after battle. How much longer could it survive? By the late 1700s, the mighty Dutch East India Company was rotting from within. Its warehouses still overflowed with spices, but its books bled red ink. Corruption had become a way of life, and the men entrusted with its fortune were quietly looting it from the inside, one shipment at a time. The whispers that began as rumors now roared like a storm. Clerks falsified records, captains smuggled cargo, and governors built private fortunes while the company starved. The very people sworn to protect this empire were tearing it apart with their bare, greedy hands. And then came war. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War erupted in 1780, and the British Royal Navy descended like a hammer. Dutch trade routes were severed, ships were captured, and the lifeblood of the company, its precious cargo, was choked off at sea. In the boardrooms of Amsterdam, the directors stared at their crumbling empire in stunned silence. The dividends they once promised investors had become impossible fantasies. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, The unthinkable word was whispered: bankruptcy. But the desperation ran deeper than money. In the distant colonies, the people who had once feared the company now sensed its weakness. Rebellions flickered to life in Java, Ceylon, and beyond. The iron grip that had ruled millions was beginning to tremble. To survive, the company borrowed recklessly. Loan upon loan piled onto a mountain of debt so vast it could never be repaid. They were no longer building an empire. They were digging a grave, financing today's survival with tomorrow's certain doom. Meanwhile, the spice trade that had birthed this giant was no longer the gold mine it once was. Prices collapsed as competitors flooded the market. The monopoly that made kings kneel had quietly slipped through the company's trembling fingers. The Dutch government watched in horror. This company's vast riches. Competition closed in like wolves. The British East India Company grew bolder, and new trading powers carved away the markets the Dutch once ruled alone. The monopoly that had made the company invincible was slipping through its fingers, year by year. By the 1780s, war with Britain shattered what remained. Dutch ships were captured, trade routes severed, and warehouses emptied. The once unstoppable VOC found itself begging the Dutch government for loans simply to survive another season. And so, in the year 1799, the impossible happened. The richest corporation the world had ever known was officially dissolved, bankrupt, broken, and buried under a mountain of debt. Its charter expired, and the greatest commercial empire in history simply ceased to exist. But the company's story doesn't end with its death. Its true legacy lives on in every modern corporation. The very idea of selling shares, of investors owning a piece of a business, that revolution was born in those Dutch trading halls 4 centuries ago. And here lies the stark warning. A company grew so powerful it ruled nations, raised armies, and answered to no one. Greed, corruption, and unchecked ambition destroyed it from within. The question echoes still. Could it happen again with the giants of today? The Dutch East India Company reminds us that no empire is eternal, not of land, nor of gold. Power without restraint always sows the seeds of its own collapse. And somewhere, in the rise and fall of today's giants, that ancient lesson is waiting to be learned. And fortresses across half the world was staggeringly expensive, and the costs eventually outgrew even the company's vast riches. Competition closed in like wolves. The British East India Company grew bolder, and new trading powers carved away the markets the Dutch once ruled alone. The monopoly that had made the company invincible was slipping through its fingers, year by year. By the 1780s, war with Britain shattered what remained. Dutch ships were captured, trade routes severed, and warehouses emptied. The once unstoppable VOC found itself begging the Dutch government for loans simply to survive another season. And so, in the year 1799, the impossible happened. The richest corporation the world had ever known was officially dissolved, bankrupt, broken, and buried under a mountain of debt. Its charter expired, and the greatest commercial empire in history simply ceased to exist. But the company's story doesn't end with its death. Its true legacy lives on in every modern corporation. The very idea of selling shares, of investors owning a piece of a business, that revolution was born in those Dutch trading halls 4 centuries ago. And here lies the stark warning. A company grew so powerful it ruled nations, raised armies, and answered to no one. Greed, corruption, and unchecked ambition destroyed it from within. The question echoes still. Could it happen again with the giants of today? The Dutch East India Company reminds us that no empire is eternal, not of land, nor of gold. Power without restraint always sows the seeds of its own collapse, and somewhere in the rise and fall of today's giants, that ancient lesson is waiting to be learned.